The stallion screamed. Not a whinny, not a warning. A full, chest-splitting scream that shook the fence posts and sent 3 grown men scrambling backward into the dirt. Caleb Whitmore didn't move. He stood at the edge of the corral, boots planted, jaw tight, watching the black horse slam itself against the rails hard enough to splinter wood, and he thought, "I've seen worse." Then he saw her, standing perfectly still at the far end of the fence, not running, not flinching, just watching the horse with something in her eyes that stopped Caleb cold. Who on earth is she? If this story already has your heart racing, hit subscribe and follow along until the very end. You won't want to miss what happens next. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Caleb Whitmore had driven 11 hours straight from Billings with a thermos of black coffee, a duffel bag of gear, and the quiet certainty of a man who believed he had already seen everything this world had to offer. He was 41 years old. He had broken horses in 7 states. He had worked ranches from the dry flats of Texas to the wind-hammered hills of Wyoming, and in that time, he had faced animals that most men wouldn't approach on a bet. He had the scars to prove it. A long one across his left forearm from a Mustang in Nevada. Another curved below his collarbone from a particularly vicious quarter horse in New Mexico that he still thought about sometimes when the weather turned cold. He did not consider himself brave. He considered himself skilled. There was a difference, and Caleb understood it better than most. Bravery was doing something dangerous without knowing the outcome. Skill was doing something dangerous because you had studied it long enough to shift the odds in your favor. He wasn't fearless, he was educated. That was the thought he carried with him when he pulled his truck off the main road and onto the gravel lane that curved up toward Hawthorne Ridge Ranch. And that was the thought he carried right up until the moment he stepped out of the truck, heard the stallion scream, and saw the woman at the fence. He would replay that moment for months afterward. Not the scream. He had heard screams like that before. What he couldn't stop replaying was her stillness. The ranch foreman met him at the gate before Caleb had finished pulling his gear from the bed of the truck. His name was Roy Haddon, a thick-armed man in his late 50s with a sun-cracked face and the permanent squint of someone who had spent too many decades looking into Montana wind. "You Whitmore?" Roy said, not as a greeting, more as a confirmation of something he'd already decided he was skeptical about. "That's me," Caleb said, extending a hand. Roy shook it once, brief and businesslike. "How many horses you broken?" "Enough to stop counting." Roy made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Good, because this one's going to make you wish you'd kept count, so you'd know what your record was before he ruined it." Caleb looked toward the corral. The black stallion was still moving, circling the perimeter with a kind of furious energy that looked almost mechanical, like an engine that had been running too hot for too long. "Thunder Vale," Roy said, following his gaze. 4 years old, 16 hands. We bought him from an operation down in Colorado 8 months ago, and in that time he's put 2 men in the hospital, broken the wrist of our best hand, and destroyed more fence than I care to calculate." "What was the operation in Colorado?" Caleb asked. Roy's jaw tightened. "Not the kind of place that treated animals particularly well." Caleb nodded slowly. That was all he needed to know. "Who's the woman?" he said. Roy turned to look. The woman at the fence hadn't moved. She was standing with both hands wrapped loosely around the top rail, her eyes on the horse, and even from this distance, 40 yards at least, there was something about her posture that was different from every other person Caleb had observed near a frightened animal. Most people leaned back. Most people showed their unease in the tightness of their shoulders, the positioning of their feet, the way they angled their bodies slightly toward the nearest exit. She was leaning in, not aggressively, not recklessly, just forward, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. "That's Evelyn," Roy said, and something shifted in his voice. Not warmth exactly, more like the complicated tone of someone describing a situation they hadn't figured out how to categorize. "Evelyn Carter, owner's daughter." "She work with horses?" Roy made that sound again. "Mr. Carter doesn't allow her to work with horses." Caleb looked at him. "Then what's she doing?" Roy crossed his arms. She calls it watching. Her father calls it wasting time. The rest of us don't know what to call it, because every once in a while she'll say something about that horse that turns out to be exactly right, and none of us can figure out how she knew. Caleb spent his first hour at Hawthorne Ridge, doing what he always did when he arrived somewhere new. Watching before touching, listening before speaking, building a picture from 1,000 small details that most people didn't notice. He watched the way the ranch hands moved around the corral. Wide arcs, quick steps, voices pitched a little too loud in the way that people get when they're trying to sound unbothered. He watched the way Thunder Vale tracked every movement from the far side of the enclosure, turning his massive head in sharp, precise increments, never letting anything get behind him. A horse that didn't let things get behind him was a horse that had learned it needed to. That told Caleb something. He walked the outside of the fence slowly, hands in his pockets, not making eye contact with the animal, letting the horse register his presence at its own pace. It was the first move he always made. Not a demonstration, not a performance, just an introduction. I'm here. I'm not rushing you. Figure me out. He was halfway around the perimeter when he reached Evelyn Carter. She didn't look at him when he stopped beside her. Her eyes stayed on the horse. "You're the Horsebreaker," she said. "I am." "That what it says on your business card? Horsebreaker?" He considered that. Horse trainer. But most people say horsebreaker. "Most people are describing what they actually do," she said quietly. Caleb felt the sentence land somewhere in his chest with a small, uncomfortable weight. He chose not to respond to it directly. "How long have you been watching him?" he asked instead. "Since they brought him here." She paused. 8 months. "Every day?" "Every day I can." Caleb looked at the horse. Thunder Vale had slowed his circling and was standing at the far end of the corral, sides heaving slightly, watching them both with ears pinned flat. "What have you figured out?" Caleb asked. Now she looked at him. It was a quick look, assessing, a little surprised, like she hadn't expected the question, like she wasn't used to being asked. "His left hind leg," she said. "He favors it when he's been standing still for more than an hour. Nobody's had a vet look at it because every time they try to get close enough, he reacts before they can get a hand on him." Caleb filed that away. "What else?" "He watches the gate," she said. "Not because he wants to escape, because that's where the bad things came from. Every time something frightened him in the past, it came through a gate. So now he watches them." Caleb stared at the horse. He watched the stallion's eyes move, not to the open ground around him, but to the heavy wooden gate on the south side of the corral. She was right. He had been standing here for less than 3 minutes, and she had given him 2 pieces of information that would have taken him days to discover on his own. "You said your father doesn't let you work with the horses," he said. "He doesn't." "Why not?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had that particular flatness of someone reciting something they've said to themselves so many times, it no longer carries the full weight it once did. "Because I'm supposed to be planning a wedding," she said, "not standing at a fence." Dinner at the Hawthorne Ridge Ranch house that evening was a formal affair in the way that only people trying very hard to seem unconcerned about something can produce. The ranch owner, Evelyn Carter, was a man in his mid-60s with the broad-shouldered build of someone who had spent his youth doing physical labor and his middle age converting that effort into authority. He sat at the head of the table with the quiet confidence of a man accustomed to being the final word in any room he occupied. He welcomed Caleb with genuine warmth, the warmth of a man who needed something and was practiced at making people feel valued before the needing began. "We've had 3 men try that horse," Edmund said, cutting into his steak with the steady precision of someone who considered imprecision a character flaw. "Good men. Experienced men. 2 of them have been riding longer than you've been alive." "With respect," Caleb said. "How they approach him is likely more important than how long they've been riding." Edmund looked up from his plate. It was a look that Caleb had seen before. Not quite offense, not quite amusement, the look of a man recalibrating. "My foreman says you didn't even go in the corral today," Edmund said. "No, sir." "You planning on going in eventually?" When the horse tells me he's ready for it. The silence at the table had a texture to it. Caleb was aware of Roy Haddon at the far end watching him steadily, of two ranch hands exchanging a glance, of Edmund Carter's jaw working slowly as he processed this answer. And he was aware of Evelyn. She was seated across from him, slightly to his left, and she had spent the entire dinner in the particular kind of quietness that isn't absence but presence. The kind of stillness that belongs to someone who has learned to take up very little space in a room while observing everything in it. She was watching him now. And for the first time since he'd arrived, she looked like she might almost smile. 3 weeks, Edmund said finally. I'll give you 3 weeks. After that, if that horse still can't be ridden, I'm going to have to make some hard decisions about what to do with him. Caleb knew what hard decisions meant. 3 weeks, he agreed. I was on the porch after dinner, finishing the last of a cup of coffee that had gone cold, when Evelyn came out and stood beside him. She didn't say anything at first. She looked out at the dark shape of the corral and the barely visible movement of the horse within it, a shadow among shadows, still restless, still circling. You actually think you can help him, she said. It wasn't a question. I think someone can, Caleb said. Whether it's me or not depends on how well I listen. She turned to look at him then, and in the low light from the porch lamp he could see something in her expression that was harder to name than curiosity. It was the look of someone who had been speaking into silence for a long time and was not yet sure they'd found someone who could hear them. Can I ask you something? She said. Go ahead. When you say you need to listen to the horse, what does that actually mean? Because most people who come here say things like that and then walk into the corral and start doing the same things that haven't worked. Caleb thought about the question for a moment. It deserved a real answer. It means the horse is already communicating, he said. The behavior people call violent, the kicking, the charging, the screaming. That's not random. That's language. Every one of those things means something specific. And if you don't understand what it means before you try to change it, you're not training a horse. You're just adding more noise to the noise it's already drowning in. Evelyn was very still. That's exactly it, she said softly. That's exactly what nobody here understands. But you do, he said. She looked at him. Something flickered behind her eyes. A complicated mixture of validation and something older, something with grief underneath it. I've been trying to tell them for 8 months, she said. My father thinks I'm being sentimental. Roy thinks I'm being naive. The hands think I'm being... She stopped. Well, you can imagine what the hands think. What do they think? She exhaled quietly. That a woman who spends her mornings at a horse corral instead of planning her future must have something wrong with her. And what do you think? The question caught her off guard. He could see it. The slight widening of her eyes. The pause before she answered, as if she genuinely wasn't accustomed to being asked what she thought. I think, she said slowly, that the horse knows something everyone around here refuses to accept. What does he know? She looked back at the dark corral. That being forced is not the same as being fixed. The second day, Caleb brought a camp stool and a book he had no intention of reading. He set the stool 6 feet from the corral fence, not so close as to crowd, not so far as to seem indifferent. And he sat down and opened the book and did not look at the horse for the better part of 2 hours. The ranch hands thought he'd lost his mind. That your method? One of them asked from a safe distance. A young man named Curtis, barely 25, with the particular brand of confidence that belongs to people who have not yet been badly wrong about anything important. Sitting there reading? Seems to be working so far, Caleb said without looking up from the page. Working how? The horse hasn't come within 40 feet of you. He's thought about it twice, Caleb said. Curtis stared at him. What? Twice in the last 90 minutes, he's taken a step toward this side of the corral and then changed his mind. That's 2 more steps toward a human being than he was willing to take yesterday. So yeah, it's working. Curtis muttered something and walked away. Evelyn arrived at 10:15, the same time she had arrived the day before. Caleb was beginning to understand that she was a person of precise habits, not because she lacked spontaneity, but because her time was not entirely her own, and she had learned to protect the corners of it with careful consistency. She took her position at the fence without speaking. She didn't look at Caleb. She looked at the horse. Thunder Vale, who had been studiously ignoring Caleb's existence, raised his head the moment she appeared. Caleb noticed it immediately. The horse's ears, which had been pinned or rotating in that constant scanning pattern of a frightened animal, came forward. Not all the way. Not the full, relaxed forward position of a horse at ease, but noticeably, measurably forward. A degree of softening that was unmistakable if you knew what to look for. "He does that every time you come," Caleb said quietly. "I know," she said. "How long has he been doing it?" She was quiet for a moment. "About 5 months ago, he stopped moving away when I came to the fence. I used to think it was just that he recognized me, but then I realized the recognition wasn't the whole thing." "What was the rest?" "He relaxed," she said simply. "Not all the way, but enough. Like he'd decided I wasn't a threat." "Did you do anything to earn that?" She considered the question seriously. "I talked to him," she said. "For months, I just talked. I told him what was happening around the ranch, what the weather was going to be. Sometimes I read out loud from whatever book I had. I didn't try to train him. I didn't try to touch him. I just—" She paused. "I let him know I was going to show up, every day, without wanting anything from him." Caleb set the book down on his knee. "You built trust," he said. "I built consistency," she corrected quietly. "I think trust was what came after." He looked at her for a long moment. She was still watching the horse, and the horse was still watching her, and there was something in the space between them. Something that was not familiarity exactly, and not communication in any language that words could reach, but something real and specific, and completely unlike anything Caleb Whitmore had witnessed in 2 decades of working with horses. "Evelyn," he said, and he used her name deliberately, giving it weight. "I'm going to need you to help me with this." She turned to look at him. That look again. The one he was starting to recognize. The look of someone hearing something they had stopped expecting to hear. "Your father won't like it," she said. "Probably not. Roy will say it's interference. Roy can say whatever he wants." She searched his face for something, for the joke, or the condescension, or the particular kind of male performance that disguises itself as generosity. She seemed to find none of those things. "What would you need me to do?" she asked. "Exactly what you've been doing," he said. "Show up, talk to him, be consistent. Just do it with me in the corral." She looked back at the horse. "Caleb," she said, and his name in her voice had a specific weight too, the weight of a woman who chose her words carefully because she had learned that carelessness with words was a luxury she couldn't afford. "If I walk into that corral with you, if I do that, and it works, what happens then?" He understood the question. She wasn't asking about the horse. "Then," he said, "we figure out what comes next." It was Roy Haddon who brought it to Evelyn Carter, as Caleb had expected. I had not made it to the end of his second full day before the ranch foreman had gone to the owner's office and laid out his concerns with the systematic thoroughness of a man who considered complaint a form of responsibility. Caleb knew because Edmund found him in the equipment barn at dusk, where Caleb was checking the condition of a halter he'd been thinking about using. Edmund came in and stood in the wide doorway, blocking enough of the remaining light that Caleb looked up. "Roy says you want to use Evelyn in the training," Edmund said. "I want to use what's working," Caleb said. "Your daughter has established a connection with that horse that none of your hands have managed in 8 months. It would be foolish not to factor that in." Edmund was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked into the barn and lowered himself onto a hay bale with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had started complaining sometime in the last decade. "Evelyn is a good girl," he said. "She's always been. She's got away with animals. I won't pretend otherwise. But, Caleb repeated. "She's not a horse trainer. She's not a ranch hand. She is a 28-year-old woman who is going to be married in 4 months to a man who is going to expect certain things of her, and spending her days in a training corral is not going to prepare her for that life." Caleb put the halter down. "Who is she marrying?" he asked. Victor Langley. His family runs the Langley cattle operation out of Cascade County. It's a good match, financially sound. Victor's a capable man. Does she love him? Edmund looked up sharply. That's not... He stopped, started again. That's not really the relevant question. It might be, Caleb said mildly. To her. Edmund stood back up, with more effort than he'd sat down with. I'm not paying you to have opinions about my family's arrangements, he said, and his voice had gone flat and cool in the way that voices go when someone is maintaining control of themselves by careful application of deliberate effort. No, sir, Caleb said. You're paying me to help your horse. And to help your horse, I need your daughter's help. Those two things are connected right now, and I can't separate them. Edmund looked at him for a long moment. 2 weeks, he said finally. You have 2 weeks to show me results. And if I see anything that looks like it's going to complicate Evelyn's situation with Victor, this arrangement ends. He left without waiting for a response. Caleb stood in the barn and listened to the sound of his footsteps recede across the gravel. And then he stood there a little longer, thinking about the word Edmund Carter had used. Complicate. Like a woman understanding horses was a complication. Like a woman being seen for what she knew was something that needed to be managed. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, which was empty at that hour. The dinner things cleared, and the room smelling of coffee, and the particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after everyone else has dispersed to their separate silences. She was sitting at the table with a notebook open in front of her. Not a journal. Pages of small, precise diagrams and notes, sketches of horse positions, annotations written in a hand that was careful and specific and dense with observation. She looked up when he came in. He talked to you, she said. He did. And? He said yes, with conditions. She nodded slowly, like someone receiving information they had already half prepared themselves for. Victor, she said. It wasn't a question. He mentioned Victor, Caleb confirmed. He sat down across from her, uninvited and unworried about it, and looked at the notebook. Can I? She hesitated. Not from reluctance, he thought, but from the ingrained reflex of someone who'd had their work dismissed enough times to have built a small wall of protection around it. Then she pushed the notebook toward him. He turned it slowly, reading the notes. The diagrams. The careful documented record of 8 months of observation. He had been doing this work for 20 years, and what he was looking at was more systematic, more detailed, and more insightful than notes he had seen from people who were paid to produce them. He looked up. Evelyn, he said. This is... He stopped, because he needed to get the next words exactly right, because this was the moment when a careless word would shut something that was just beginning to open. This is genuinely extraordinary. Do you understand that? She watched him carefully. I understand that you're saying it, she said. I mean it. People say things they mean in the moment, she said quietly. And then later they remember who they're talking to and revise. The sentence landed with a specific heaviness. He turned it over. Who revised on you? He asked. She looked down at the notebook. My father used to look at my work, she said. When I was younger, he used to ask me about it. For a while, for a few years, he'd even take my observations to the ranch vet and they'd talk about them. She paused. Then I got older, and the conversations about my future changed, and after a while my father stopped asking about my notebooks. He never said anything. He just stopped asking. Caleb looked at the table between them. I'm asking, he said. She looked up at him. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The kitchen held the kind of quiet that isn't empty, the kind that has things living in it. Tomorrow morning, she said finally. I'll be at the fence at 8. I'll already be there, he said. The third morning, Caleb opened the corral gate and walked in alone. He did it without announcement, without an audience, before the ranch hands were fully assembled and before Edmund Carter had come down from the house. He wanted the first entry to be quiet. Not a performance, not an occasion, just a fact. I'm in the space now. Adjust. Thunder Vale moved immediately to the far end of the corral, and Caleb led him. He walked to the center of the corral and stopped. He stood with his back turned partially toward the horse, a counterintuitive posture that most people found impossible to maintain with a frightened animal at their back. But that communicated, in the language horses actually speak, something critical. I'm not hunting you. He stood like that for 40 minutes. Thunder Vale did not approach, but he stopped retreating. That was the day's work. Caleb came out, latched the gate, and stood beside Evelyn at the fence. He stopped retreating, she said. You saw it. Around the 20-minute mark. She paused. He was watching your shoulders. Caleb looked at her. My shoulders. Horses read shoulders, she said simply. Predators drop their shoulders when they're hunting. Yours were relaxed, he noticed. Caleb had known this. What startled him was that she knew it, and the specific, confident way she said it, not as a theory, but as an observed fact. Where did you learn that? He asked. She shrugged slightly. I watched. For 8 months I watched, and I read everything I could find about equine behavior, and I looked at what the book said, and then I looked at the horse, and I figured out which things were true, and which things were written by people who mostly watched other people watch horses. Something moved through Caleb's chest. It wasn't admiration exactly, though it was related to that. It was the specific and slightly humbling feeling of recognizing competence in a place you hadn't thought to look for it. You're going to help me with something tomorrow, he said. What? I'm going to go in the corral, and I want you to talk to him from the fence, the same way you always do. She was quiet for a moment. You think if he hears my voice, he'll stay calmer. I think he already has a positive association with your voice. I want to use that association to change his association with a human being in his space. She nodded slowly. You're using me as a bridge. You've been building the bridge for 8 months, he said. I'm just asking if I can walk across it. A pause. Caleb, she said, and there was something careful in her voice, careful and a little raw underneath, like a question she'd been sitting with for a long time, and was only now allowing herself to ask out loud. What happens to horses like him? In the end, not the ones you fix, the ones that don't get fixed. What happens to them? He looked at her. She was looking at the horse, and her hands were wrapped around the fence rail, and she was holding on with a tightness that was not fear. It was the particular kind of grip that belongs to someone bracing themselves against an answer they already suspect. They get put down, he said, or sold to people who don't ask as many questions as they should, which usually amounts to the same thing, just slower. She didn't flinch, but something in the set of her jaw changed. Not this one, she said. It was quiet and certain and absolute, the way a decision sounds when it's already been made, and the person saying it is simply stating it for the record. Caleb looked at her. The woman standing quietly at the fence, he thought, is not watching the horse. She is keeping watch over him. There was a difference, and he was only just beginning to understand what that difference meant. He had come to this ranch to break a horse. I was starting to understand, with the dawning discomfort of a man having his certainties revised one by one, that breaking was not the same as healing, and that the woman who had been told to stay at the fence might be the only person at Hawthorne Ridge Ranch who already knew the difference. He just hadn't been listening yet. Now he was. The fourth morning came in hard and cold, the kind of cold that gets into the bones before a person is fully awake, and Caleb was already at the corral gate at 7:50 when Evelyn arrived at 8, exactly as she had said she would. She was carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed one to him without ceremony, without asking if he wanted it, the way people do when they've decided a small thing matters and aren't interested in making a production of it. He took it. Their fingers didn't touch, but the warmth of the mug did something to the morning that Caleb noticed and didn't say anything about. He was moving last night, she said, looking at Thunder Vale. Around midnight. I could hear him from my window. Anxious or restless? She thought about the distinction. He could see her thinking about it, which was itself something. Most people would have answered immediately. She took the question seriously. Restless, she said finally. Like something on his mind, rather than something he was afraid of. Good, Caleb said. Anxious horses are reacting. Restless horses are processing. She looked at him. You think he's working through something. I think something shifted for him yesterday. When an animal that's been in survival mode for years suddenly gets a day where nothing bad happens. The nervous system doesn't know what to do with that. It has to recalibrate. He drank the coffee. It was strong and good. It takes time, the recalibration, but it's a sign. A sign of what? That there's something worth recalibrating for. She was quiet for a moment, both of them standing at the fence, the horse at the far end watching them with those large, dark, extraordinarily expressive eyes that horses have, eyes that miss nothing and hold everything. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah. Victor is coming Friday." He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the horse. "Your father told me." "Did he tell you why?" "To check on the progress of the training." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Victor doesn't care about the training. Victor cares that there's an asset on this ranch that isn't performing. He helped my father negotiate the original purchase price of Thunder Vale, and he considers the horse's situation a reflection on his judgment. So he's coming to protect his reputation," Caleb said. "He's coming to see whether the horse should be sold or put down," she said flatly, "and to discuss the wedding arrangements over dinner, and to make my father feel that everything is moving in the right direction." Now Caleb looked at her. She was watching the horse with that particular stillness of hers, and her jaw was set in a way that told him she had been carrying this information since at least the previous evening, and had made her peace with a certain amount of it, and had not yet made her peace with the rest. "How much time does that give us?" he said. 4 days. He looked back at the corral. "Then let's stop standing at the fence," he said, and he unlatched the gate. She followed him in before he could say another word. He hadn't invited her. He had assumed they would work their way up to it, that he would go in first, and she would stay at the fence and use her voice from a safe distance. He turned to look at her, and she looked back at him with an expression that said, very clearly, that she understood the risk she had just accepted and had calculated it herself without needing his input. Thunder Vale exploded. Not at them. Not a charge, not an attack. But the sudden presence of 2 humans in his space at once sent the stallion into a full, frantic circuit of the corral. Hooves thundering against the packed earth, body straining at the edges of the enclosure with the specific violence of an animal that has learned that more people means more danger. Caleb stopped moving immediately. He held up one hand to signal Evelyn to do the same, and she did. She froze, and her stillness was so immediate and so complete that it almost surprised him. Not almost. It surprised him. They stood. The horse ran. 30 seconds. A minute. The circuit slowing. The breathing enormous and ragged. A minute 30. And then Evelyn started talking. Not to Caleb, to the horse. Her voice was low and completely steady. The voice of someone who had been practicing this for 8 months, who had found the precise register and rhythm that meant safety to this specific animal. She talked about nothing in particular. The weather, something she had read the evening before, the way the morning light was sitting. It didn't matter what she said. He understood that instinctively. What mattered was the sound, the rhythm, the continuity. The promise underneath every word. I am here. Nothing bad is happening. I am still here. Thunder Vale slowed. His circuit tightened, became less frantic, the frantic burning down into something that was still fear, but was beginning to have edges. He was tracking them both now, head swinging between them in rapid assessments. Caleb watched the horse's eyes. He watched the ears. He watched the angle of the hindquarters, which told him more about an animal's intentions than most people would ever understand. And he watched the moment. It came 3 minutes and 40-something seconds into Evelyn's continuous, quiet, steady talking, when Thunder Vale stopped running. He stood at the center of the corral, sides heaving, and he looked at Evelyn. Not at Caleb, at Evelyn, and his ears came forward, just slightly, just enough. "Keep talking," Caleb said, very quietly. She kept talking. Caleb took 1 step toward the horse. Then he stopped and waited. Thunder Vale's eyes cut to him, sharp and assessing, but he didn't move, and after 4 seconds his gaze moved back to Evelyn. Another step. Stop. Wait. This was the work. This was the whole of it. Not dramatic, not fast, Not the kind of thing that looked impressive from the outside. Just a series of small decisions, each one asking the same question. Is this okay? Can we go one more step? And the answer coming back not in words, but in the angle of an ear, the shift of a hoof, the long, slow exhalation of a breath held too long. Caleb got to within 8 feet of Thunder Vale. He stopped there. He did not try to go further. He stood and breathed and let the horse smell him and decide what he was. Evelyn was still talking. Something about a book she'd read as a child. He caught fragments of it. A story about a girl who found a horse in a valley and brought it home. Her voice had something in it now that it hadn't had when she started. Something that was more than the practiced calm. Something personal. I understood, listening to her, that she wasn't just keeping the horse calm. She was telling the horse something true about herself. And horses, Caleb had learned in 20 years, were extraordinarily good at hearing the truth underneath the words. He stood at 8 feet for 11 minutes. Then he took one more step. Thunder Vale flinched, a full-body shudder, the muscles across his back rippling in a wave. But he didn't move his feet. And Caleb stood at 7 feet from a horse that had put 2 men in the hospital, and the horse looked at him, and Caleb looked back, and between them was something that was not trust yet, but was something slightly less than fear, which was, in its own way, everything. When they came out of the corral 15 minutes later, Roy Haddon was standing at the fence with his arms crossed and an expression that was working hard to be skeptical and not entirely succeeding. "That it?" Roy said. "You went in there and stood around?" "For today," Caleb said. "Victor Langley's coming Friday. Edmund wants to show him progress." "What does progress look like to Victor Langley?" Evelyn said. Her voice was neutral. Too neutral. The kind of neutral that is a controlled surface over something with heat underneath it. Roy looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Not unkindly, but uncomfortably. The way a man's face shifts when he's about to say something he knows is unfair and can't find a way to avoid saying it anyway. "Progress looks like a horse a man can ride," he said. "Then that's not a progress question," she said. "That's a timeline question. And the timeline we're working with isn't about Victor Langley's comfort." Roy opened his mouth. "She's right," Caleb said. Quiet. Level. Non-negotiable. Roy closed his mouth. He looked between the two of them. At Caleb, then at Evelyn, then back at Caleb. And whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes produced an answer he clearly didn't love, because he uncrossed his arms and walked away without another word. Evelyn watched him go. Then she looked down at her hands, and Caleb saw that they were trembling. Very slightly. A fine tremor that had nothing to do with cold. "You okay?" he said. "I'm fine." A pause. "I don't usually—" Another pause. She exhaled. "I don't usually say things like that out loud." "Like what?" "Like, what I actually think. To Roy. To anyone here." She looked up. It felt very strange. Good strange or bad strange? She thought about it. A real answer, like always. "Like a muscle I forgot I had," she said. "Good strange, with some soreness." Caleb looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Use it more," he said. "That muscle." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That almost smile followed Caleb through the rest of his morning and into the afternoon, and sat with him through dinner. And he was aware of it in the way a person is aware of a sound they can't quite identify. Something at the edge of perception that keeps pulling the attention back, quiet and persistent, and not entirely comfortable. High had a rule about other people he worked with. He had built this rule over 20 years of moving from ranch to ranch, town to town, never staying anywhere long enough to become part of it. The rule was simple: do the job, do it well, and do not let the job become something it isn't. High had broken horses. He had trained horses. He had worked beside a great many people in the process, and he had liked some of them, and respected many of them, and stayed friends with almost none of them, because staying required a kind of rootedness that he had never figured out how to grow. He looked at his plate at the dinner table and thought about the almost smile. The rule, he noted privately, was beginning to feel less like wisdom and more like a habit he had mistaken for wisdom. I was not yet sure what to do with that distinction. The days before Victor Langley's arrival passed in a rhythm that Caleb would remember afterward as the first period of his adult life that felt genuinely purposeful rather than just productive. There was a difference, he was learning. Productive meant completing tasks. Purposeful meant that the tasks were adding up to something. The something was Thunder Vale, who on the second day of corral work allowed Caleb to approach within 5 feet before shuddering away. On the third day, 4 feet. On the morning of the fourth day, Friday, the day of Victor Langley's arrival, Caleb stood close enough to the horse to feel the warmth radiating from his body, and Thunder Vale stood still, trembling with the concentrated effort of overriding an instinct that had kept him alive through things Caleb preferred not to imagine, and he did not run. Evelyn was talking from 2 feet to Caleb's left. She had moved into the corral with him every morning without being asked. She had stopped asking for permission, not defiantly, just quietly, as if she had made an internal decision that some things were too important to make contingent on other people's comfort. She stood beside him now with the easy familiarity of someone who had found the correct position in a piece of work she had been preparing for without knowing it. Caleb raised his hand toward the horse's neck. Slow, slower than slow, a movement so gradual it was almost below the threshold of perception. Thunder Vale's ears pinned flat. Caleb stopped, waited, breathed. The ears came back. Cautious, but back. He moved his hand again. 3 more inches. Stopped. Evelyn's voice, beside him, steady as a current. The story of the girl and the horse in the valley. He'd heard pieces of it every morning now. She returned to it the way people return to something that was true for them once, that is still true in the ways that count. His fingertips touched the horse's neck. Just for a second. Just for the length of a breath. Thunder Vale shuddered the full length of his body and held. And Caleb heard Evelyn stop talking mid-sentence. Not from fear, but from the specific breathlessness of witnessing something that you have been waiting a very long time to see. He stepped back. He lowered his hand. He turned to look at her. Her eyes were bright. Not crying, not yet. But the brightness that is the thing just before tears, the brightness of a feeling that is too large to be fully contained. He let you, she said. He let us, Caleb said. She looked at him, and the almost smile was back, and this time it went further. This time it became an actual smile, full and unguarded and completely without artifice, the smile of a woman who had stopped managing her expression for just long enough to show what was underneath. It was the most beautiful thing Caleb Whitmore had seen in a very long time. And that was the exact moment they heard the truck. A large truck, expensive, the sound of it moving up the gravel lane with the particular confidence of a vehicle whose owner expected roads to accommodate themselves to his arrival. Caleb looked toward the sound. Evelyn's smile disappeared. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The change in her face said everything a person needed to know about Victor Langley before Victor Langley had even stepped out of his vehicle. The man who climbed down from that truck was perhaps 45, built with the thickness of someone who had been athletic in youth and had converted that athleticism into bulk rather than maintaining it. He wore good boots and a good jacket and a hat that was clean in a way that working hats never are, and he walked toward the corral with the unhurried authority of a man who had never been told to wait for anything. He looked at the corral. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at Caleb. His gaze traveled across all 3 things with the same assessing quality: horse, woman, stranger, and landed back on Evelyn with a smile that was warm on the surface and proprietary underneath. "Evie," he said, "you're at the fence again." "I'm working," she said. Something moved across Victor Langley's face, too fast for most people to catch. Caleb caught it. "Working," Victor repeated, and in his repetition of the word, he managed to strip it of its legitimacy without technically disagreeing with it. "Well, your father's expecting me at the house. Come on up when you're done. Working." He said it to her, but he was looking at Caleb. "Victor Langley," he said, extending his hand to Caleb. "Caleb Whitmore." The handshake was the kind that men use to gather information. Pressure, duration, the angle of the grip. Caleb shook hands the way he did everything, without performance, without competition, and released. "How's the horse coming?" Victor said, looking at Thunder Vale with the eyes of a man calculating resale value. "Making progress," Caleb said. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Edmund said 3 weeks from your arrival, which puts us at 13 days from now, Caleb said. Give or take. Can he be ridden in 13 days? Whether he can be ridden and whether he should be ridden are two different questions. Victor looked at him. The warmth in his expression had developed a thin crust. "I'm asking the first one." "I know," Caleb said. "I answered the second one, because it's the one that matters." There was a brief silence that had a very specific texture to it. The texture of a man recalibrating whether he was being challenged and deciding, provisionally, to treat it as a misunderstanding. "Dinner's at 7, Victor said. He looked at Evelyn. "Your father wants you there at 6:30. A pause. "Dressed." He walked toward the house. Evelyn watched him go. She stood at the corral fence and watched Victor Langley walk across the yard with his unhurried authority and his clean hat, and she held the fence rail with both hands, and she did not say anything for a long moment. Then, "You shouldn't have done that." "Done what?" "Disagreed with him, in front of me." She looked at Caleb. "He'll make it into something." "He'll make what into something?" "You, standing there, disagreeing with him in front of me." Her voice was patient and tired in equal measure, the patience and tiredness of someone explaining a geography they know by heart and wish they didn't. "He'll decide it means something about me, about my loyalty to him, about whether I'm—" She stopped. "Whether you're what?" She looked at the horse. "Whether I'm manageable," she said quietly. "That's the word he uses. Manageable. It's not a compliment when he says it about horses, and it's not a compliment when he says it about people." A pause. "He just doesn't know that I can hear the difference." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said carefully, "do you want to marry him?" She didn't answer immediately. She turned the question over in a silence that was not evasion, but genuine examination. The kind of honest reckoning that some people never do because it's too uncomfortable, and some people do constantly because they can't function without it. Evelyn, he had come to understand, was the second kind. "I want," she started. Stopped. "I want what this ranch would look like in 10 years if it was run by someone who understood what these animals need." She paused. "And I am trying very hard, every single day, not to think about whether I am actually going to get any version of that." It was the most honest thing she had said to him. And the most honest thing about it was not the words. It was the fact that she had said it at all. Inside the house, a door opened and closed. Victor Langley's voice drifted across the yard, easy and confident, carrying the particular volume of a man who had never needed to moderate it. Thunder Vale, at the far end of the corral, lifted his head toward the sound, his ears pinned flat. Caleb watched the horse and thought, sometimes an animal knows something before the people around it do. Sometimes the fear is the most honest thing in the room. And he stood beside Evelyn at the fence, and the distance between them was 8 inches, and it felt like the most significant 8 inches on the property. And neither of them moved to close it, and neither of them moved away. Inside the house, Victor Langley's voice rose in something that was almost laughter, but not quite. Outside, at the fence, 2 people stood in the particular silence of a decision that has not yet been made, but has begun, without permission, to make itself. Dinner at the Hawthorne Ridge Ranch house that Friday evening was a performance, and everyone at the table knew it, and nobody said so. Victor Langley sat to Evelyn Carter's right, which was not an accident. He had the easy, practiced comfort of a man who understood the geometry of dining rooms, who sat where, what it meant, how to position himself in a room so that the room organized itself around him without anyone quite noticing that it had. He poured wine with a host's confidence, despite being a guest. He asked Edmund questions about the ranch's quarterly numbers with the fluency of a man who had already reviewed them. He did all of this pleasantly, warmly, without a single visible seam. Caleb watched from the far end of the table and said very little and learned a great deal. Evelyn sat across from Victor. She was dressed as he had asked. a dark blue dress that she wore with the particular straightness of someone who has put on a costume and is reminding themselves of the person underneath it. She answered questions when addressed. She smiled when smiling was indicated. And she did something with her eyes, all through dinner, that Caleb doubted anyone else at the table noticed. She kept them 1 degree to the left of wherever Victor was looking, so that she was never quite meeting his gaze and never quite refusing to. It was a survival technique. He recognized it the way you recognize something you've seen before, without knowing where. "The horse," Victor said, somewhere between the main course and whatever came after it, setting his fork down with the deliberate care of a man shifting conversational gears. "Caleb, I want to understand your method. Because from what I saw this afternoon, you're spending a considerable amount of time in that corral, doing what appears to be nothing." "Appearing to do nothing," Caleb said, "is a significant part of the method." Victor smiled. It was a good smile, practiced, warm, the kind of smile that had gotten Victor Langley a great many things in his life. "I appreciate that. But there is a practical reality here. That horse represents a financial investment that has been returning nothing for 8 months. Edmund is a patient man, but patience has a cost. So does impatience," Caleb said. 2 hospitalized men, 1 broken wrist, fence damage, veterinary bills from the injuries. He kept his voice level, almost conversational. "Impatience has already cost this ranch more than patience will." Victor's smile held, but something behind it adjusted. "Fair point. I'm simply wondering whether your approach accounts for the timeline." "My approach accounts for the horse," Caleb said. "And Evelyn's involvement?" Victor said, and his voice had acquired the particular lightness of a man introducing a subject he has thought about carefully and chosen to present as casual. "Roy tells me she's been going into the corral with you." The table went quiet in the specific way that tables go quiet when something has been said that everyone recognizes as a move. Edmund Carter set down his glass. Evelyn set down her fork. Caleb looked at Victor Langley and took 1 measured breath. "Evelyn has knowledge of that horse that is directly relevant to the training," he said. "Using that knowledge is the professionally correct decision." "Of course," Victor said pleasantly. "I only mention it because—" He glanced at Evelyn, and his glance was warm and proprietary and utterly certain of itself. The glance of a man who has confused ownership with affection for so long, he can no longer feel the difference. Evie has a tendency to get attached, to animals, to situations, and I wouldn't want her commitment to this project to put her in a position that's physically dangerous." "She hasn't been in any danger," Caleb said. "That's reassuring. I just think—" Victor paused, as if choosing his next words with care, but the pause was performance. He had known what he was going to say before he sat down. "I think there's a version of this where Caleb does his excellent work, and Evelyn supports from a comfortable distance, the way she's been doing for the past 8 months. The way she's been doing, invisible, at the fence, not counted." Caleb opened his mouth. Evelyn spoke first. "Victor," she said, and her voice was the same voice she used with the horse, low, steady, with the particular precision of someone who has chosen each word for exactly what it carries. "I am going to ask you something, and I would like a real answer." Victor looked at her. He was surprised. Not threatened, not yet, just surprised in the way that a man who has never been interrupted by the specific person interrupting him registers the novelty of the experience. "Of course," he said. "Did you look at the horse this afternoon, when you came to the corral?" "I looked at the corral." "Yes." "Did you look at the horse?" she repeated. Not louder, just more precise. At his eyes. At the way he was standing. At the difference between what he looked like this afternoon and what he looked like 4 days ago. Victor's smile was still there, but it was doing more work now. "I'm not sure I have a trained enough eye to—" "You don't," she said simply. "That's my point. You came to the corral today, and you looked at the situation, and you made a judgment. And your judgment was based on what you could see with an untrained eye, which is a man and a woman standing near a horse that isn't being ridden yet. And so you decided that nothing was happening." She paused. "But something is happening. Something that has taken 8 months, and the knowledge of what this horse has been through and what he needs. And I am the only person on this property who has been paying close enough attention to understand it. And you are asking Caleb to do his job without his best resource because you are uncomfortable with what it looks like. The dining room held the silence of a particular kind. The kind that follows something true being said in a room full of people who were not expecting truth. Edmund Carter was looking at his daughter. His expression was unreadable in the way that faces become unreadable when they are feeling several contradictory things at once. Roy Haddon, seated at the table's end, had his eyes on his plate. Victor Langley looked at Evelyn for a long moment, and then he did something Caleb had not expected. He laughed. Not cruelly, not dismissively. A genuine laugh. The laugh of a man who has been caught off guard and is deciding, in real time, that the most powerful response available to him is to treat this as charming. "You're something, Evie," he said, with the affectionate certainty of a man who believes that a woman speaking her mind is an endearing quirk rather than a statement of fact. "You really are." Evelyn looked at him. She did not smile back. That was the moment, quiet, undramatic, barely visible, when Caleb understood that whatever Evelyn Carter had been working through in the private interior of herself, she was somewhere close to done working through it. He said nothing. He picked up his glass. He drank. Across the table, Evelyn picked up her fork and resumed eating, and did not say another word through the rest of dinner, and her silence had a different quality than the silence she had been maintaining all evening. It was no longer accommodation. It was decision. The argument happened after dinner. Caleb didn't hear it directly. He had taken himself to the porch with a cup of coffee and the deliberate intention of being unavailable, because some things were not his to be in the middle of, and a conversation between Evelyn and Victor Langley in the front hallway of her father's house was one of them. But the ranch house walls were old, and the night was quiet, and voices carry. Victor's voice carried most. Not because he was shouting. He was not the kind of man who shouted. Caleb suspected, because shouting suggested a loss of control he would never allow himself. But he spoke at a volume that made it clear he was accustomed to being heard, and the rhythm of his speech had acquired an edge that the dinner table smoothness had concealed. "Not asking you to stop caring about the animals. I'm asking you to think about the impression." Evelyn's voice was lower, less distinct, but the steadiness of it reached the porch. The unbroken steadiness. "Always been this way, and I've been patient." The steadiness again. Something precise. "Carter, listen to me." "Evelyn." Silence. Then the sound of a door, not slammed, but closed with the firm finality that is more emphatic than a slam. Then Victor Langley's footsteps crossing the hall, and the front door opening, and the crunch of good boots on gravel, and the sound of his truck door closing, and an engine, and then nothing. Caleb sat on the porch and listened to the nothing. I was still sitting there, 20 minutes later, when Evelyn came out. She sat down in the chair beside his without asking, and pulled her knees up to her chest, and wrapped her arms around them. And she looked at the dark corral for a long time without speaking. "He's not gone," she said finally. "He's staying in the guest cabin. My father invited him to stay through the weekend." "Okay," Caleb said. "I wants to watch the training tomorrow." She paused. "He wants to see what I do, what we do. I think he's decided to understand it so he can manage it." Caleb said nothing for a moment. "Evelyn," he said, "what do you want? Not what your father wants, not what Victor wants. What do you actually want to happen?" She kept her eyes on the corral. "I want that horse to be okay," she said. "That's the first thing. That's the thing I started with, and I haven't moved from." "And the rest?" She breathed in slowly and let it out. "I want to build something," she said. "I have had this idea, this specific, detailed, entirely planned out idea, for 4 years. A rehabilitation program. Not just for one horse, for horses like him. Animals that have been through systems that broke them. I know what it would take. I know how to structure it, how to fund it, what it would need. I have notebooks full of it." "I've seen your notebooks," he said. She turned to look at him. "I know you have, but you haven't seen all of them." That landed with weight he hadn't expected. "How many are there?" he asked. 11, she said. "Over 4 years." 11 notebooks. 4 years. A plan that was fully formed, deeply researched, sitting in a stack somewhere in this house, read by nobody because nobody had asked. "Why haven't you shown your father?" Caleb said. "I did," she said. "Once, 2 years ago." He waited. "He said it was a nice idea," she said. "He said it with the specific kindness that people use when they mean it will until now," Caleb thought. Until a man who arrived to break a horse asked to see her notes and meant it, and she pushed them across a table without being sure yet whether to trust him. I was aware of how much that had cost her. "I want you to show me all of them," he said. She looked at him. The darkness was thick enough that he couldn't read her expression fully, but he could read the quality of her stillness. The way it had changed from the defensive stillness of self-protection to something more open, more uncertain in the way that hope is always uncertain. "Caleb." "I mean it," he said. "Not because I'm trying to give you something, because what you've built in those notebooks deserves to exist in the world, and I'd like to understand it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She went inside. He sat in the darkness and thought about 11 notebooks and 4 years, and a woman who had kept building something in the dark because the building itself was necessary, even when nobody was watching. The next morning came fast and cold, and Victor Langley arrived at the corral at 9:15 with his clean hat and his assessing eyes, and the particular alertness of a man who has decided to understand something in order to neutralize it. He stood outside the fence, and he watched. Caleb and Evelyn went through their morning work methodically. The entry, the patience, the graduated approach, the voice, the slow accumulation of trust that looked like nothing from the outside and was everything from the inside. Thunder Vale, who had allowed touch the previous morning, was more cautious today. The presence of a new person at the fence, a person whose energy had the specific quality of someone who wants something from the situation, had put a tightness back into his movements. "He knows Victor's there," Evelyn said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. "Give him time." "Victor won't give him time," she said, just as quietly. "He's been standing at that fence for 12 minutes. I can feel him getting impatient from here." She was right. Caleb could feel it too. The way the energy at the perimeter of the corral had a restless quality, a building pressure. Victor Langley, standing outside a fence watching something happen at a pace he couldn't control. "Keep talking to him," Caleb said. She did. And Thunder Vale slowly, incrementally, recalibrated toward the voice he trusted. His circling slowed. His ears moved. Caleb got to 5 feet, then 4. The horse's breathing deepened, not from relaxation, but from the effort of overriding instinct, that concentrated animal courage that most people never recognize because they're watching the fear instead of the fight against it. 3 feet. Caleb raised his hand, and then Victor Langley opened the gate. Not slowly, not carefully. He pushed it open with the directness of a man who has made a decision and is not second-guessing it, and the metal latch cracked against the post with a sound that in the silence of the corral was enormous, and Thunder Vale exploded. Not toward them. Away. A full panicked retreat to the far end of the corral, hitting the rails, spinning, the whites of his eyes showing, the breathing instantly ragged and desperate. All the work of the morning, all the careful accumulation of those minutes, detonated in a single second. Caleb spun around. Victor was inside the gate. "Get out," Caleb said. "I just want to get out now." His voice had a quality he rarely used. Not loud, but absolute, the voice of someone who is done negotiating. "You just cost us 3 days of work in 3 seconds. Get out of this corral before something gets hurt." Victor stopped. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was managing its anger with visible effort. Then he looked at the horse, which was slamming itself against the far railing in full panic, and whatever argument he was assembling in his head collided with the reality in front of him and lost. He stepped back through the gate. Caleb turned back to the horse. "Talk to him," he said to Evelyn. She was already talking. It took 22 minutes. 22 minutes of her voice, steady and specific and true, talking the horse down from the edge of the fear and back toward the fragile thing they had been building. Caleb stood still in the center of the corral and didn't move and didn't try to rush it, because rushing it now would cost them more than the 22 minutes already had. At minute 22, Thunder Vale's breathing slowed. At minute 24, his feet stopped moving. At minute 26, his ears, still cautious, still watchful, moved forward a degree. Caleb walked out of the corral. Victor was still at the fence. He had stayed. Caleb gave him that much. He hadn't walked away. He was watching the horse with an expression that had lost its assessing quality and replaced it with something rawer and more honest. The expression of a man who has done something he can't undo and is understanding, fully, what it cost. "I didn't know it would," he started. "I told you he wasn't ready," Caleb said. Flat, not angry now, just clear. "I told you directly. Evelyn told you. We told you before you got on your truck and drove up here, and we told you again at dinner, and you came into this corral anyway because you decided that what you could see from outside the fence was an accurate picture of what was happening inside it." Victor was quiet. "That horse has been abused," Caleb said, "by people who thought they knew better than the animal what the animal needed. Every time someone walks into his space without earning the right to be there, he learns again that humans can't be trusted. You just taught him that lesson one more time. And undoing that, undoing it enough that he can be healthy, is going to take time and patience, and the knowledge that Evelyn has been building for 8 months." He paused. "So I'm going to ask you, with respect, to stay on the outside of that fence for the remainder of your visit." Victor looked at him. Then he looked at Evelyn, who was still inside the corral, still talking to Thunder Vale, still doing what she had been doing every day for 8 months, showing up, being consistent, earning what could not be demanded. Something moved across Victor Langley's face. It was complicated and layered, and Caleb could not read all of it. But the part he could read was the part that looked, for the first time, like genuine reckoning. Like a man looking at a woman, he thought he understood, and finding that his picture of her was missing most of the important details. "She's good," Victor said. Quiet, almost to himself. "She's more than good," Caleb said. "She's the most naturally gifted horse person I have encountered in 20 years of doing this work. And she has been standing at a fence instead of doing this work because the people around her decided what she should be before she had a chance to show what she was." Victor looked at him. The layer of warmth had stripped away entirely. What was underneath was neither hostile nor friendly. It was the face of a man doing an honest calculation. "You're in love with her," Victor said. Caleb felt the sentence hit. He didn't let it show. "I'm telling you what I've observed professionally," he said. "Sure you are," Victor said. But he said it without venom. With something that was almost understanding. He looked back at Evelyn, who had moved to within 8 feet of the horse and was still talking, the horse's head lowering incrementally, the panic receding breath by breath under the influence of a voice that meant only one thing: "You are safe. I am here. You are safe." Victor Langley watched this for a long time. Then he put his hands in his pockets and turned and walked toward the guest cabin, and he didn't look back. Caleb stood at the fence and watched him go. And then he looked at Evelyn, and she was looking at him, the horse now standing calm beside her like an animal who has found, at last, what it was looking for. She raised her eyebrows at him. "What did he say?" He shook his head slightly. "Later." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned back to the horse and kept her hand on his neck and kept talking, and Thunder Vale dropped his head and exhaled like a creature releasing something it had been holding for a very long time. And Caleb stood at the fence, outside the corral, and watched the woman who had been told to stay at the fence change the thing that everyone else had given up on. And he thought, "I have been doing this work for 20 years. I have traveled to 7 states. I have helped a great many animals and a smaller number of people, and I have kept moving because moving felt like the point. And I am standing at a fence in Montana watching someone who isn't me do the most important part of the work. And I do not want to move from this spot." That was the thought he was carrying. Quiet and unfamiliar, and more honest than most of the thoughts he'd had in years. When Roy Haddon appeared beside him, and said, low and without preamble, "Edmund wants to see you, both of you, tonight." Caleb looked at him. "What's it about?" Roy's jaw worked for a moment. He looked at Evelyn, then at the horse, then at the ground, and when he looked back up, his expression had something in it that Caleb had not seen there before. It looked, against all expectation, like guilt. "Victor talked to him," Roy said, "before he went to the cabin." A pause. "I don't know exactly what he said, but Edmund's face when he came out of that conversation—" He stopped. "Just come at 7, he said. "Both of you." He walked away. Caleb stood at the fence. Inside the corral, Evelyn was still with the horse, still talking, still being exactly what she was, unaware that somewhere in the house, her father had just heard something from the man she was supposed to marry that was about to change what tonight looked like. And Caleb had no way of knowing yet whether the change was going to be the kind that opened a door or the kind that closed one. He reached out and put his hands on the fence rail, and he held on, and he waited. At 6:55 that evening, Caleb knocked on the door of Edmund Carter's study and heard the old man say, "Come in," with the particular heaviness of someone who has been sitting in a room rehearsing a conversation for the past 2 hours and still isn't sure he's ready for it. He went in alone. Evelyn was supposed to come at 7. He had 5 minutes, and he intended to use them. Edmund was behind his desk. Not working, just sitting, the way a man sits when the desk is something to put between himself and whatever is coming. He looked older than he had at dinner the night before, which was the thing that happened to people when they stopped performing and let the weight of a thing settle onto their actual face. "Sit down, Caleb," he said. Caleb sat. "Victor spoke to me this afternoon," Edmund said. He picked up a pen and set it down again, a small fidgeting that Caleb suspected the man would have been embarrassed to know was visible. "He told me what happened at the corral." "Then you know he opened the gate without permission and set the training back 3 days, Caleb said. Edmund looked at him. "That's not quite how he described it." "I imagine not." A pause. Edmund turned the pen over. "He said that the situation out there, the arrangement between you and Evelyn, has gotten complicated." "The arrangement is that your daughter is helping me train a horse that nobody else on this property could get near," Caleb said. "That's not complicated. That's straightforward. Victor thinks—" "Edmund." Caleb leaned forward slightly. He kept his voice respectful and didn't let it become hard, but he didn't let it become soft either. "With respect, what does Victor Langley actually know about what's happening with that horse? He was here for one morning. He opened a gate he had no business opening and undid 3 weeks of careful work in 3 seconds, and his assessment of the situation is the one you're weighing?" Edmund was quiet. "Your daughter," Caleb said, and he put a deliberate weight on the words, "has been observing that animal every day for 8 months. She has documentation that any professional in my field would consider extraordinary. She understands the psychology of that horse in a way that I, with 20 years of experience, found immediately useful and completely credible. And she has been doing all of this from outside a fence because the people who love her decided what she should be before they asked what she was." The pen stopped moving. "That's not fair," Edmund said quietly. "I think it is," Caleb said. "But I think you know that already, or this conversation would be going differently." Edmund looked at him for a long moment, and then something in the old man's face did something complicated. Not collapse, not quite, but a shift. The kind that happens when a person sets down something heavy they've been carrying at an angle that hurt and finally holds it straight. "She was always the one who—" He stopped, started again. "When she was young, she could tell things about animals that none of us could explain. The ranch vet used to say she had something that couldn't be taught." He paused. "I used to be proud of that." "What changed?" Caleb said. Edmund set the pen down. "Her mother died," he said. 12 years ago, and after that—" He looked at his desk. "After that, I needed things to be settled. I needed to know that Evelyn would be taken care of, that the ranch would be secure, that there was a plan. Victor's family has resources, stability. Victor is—" He stopped. "Victor is manageable," Caleb said quietly. Edmund looked up sharply. That's her word, Caleb said. She said Victor uses it about horses and about people, and she can hear the difference. He paused. I think you can too. The study was very quiet. Outside, somewhere across the yard, Thunder Vale moved in the corral. A single heavy sound, hoof on packed earth, and then silence. Edmund Carter looked at the desk and didn't speak for a long time. When he looked up, something had changed in him. Not dramatically, not all at once, the way change rarely comes all at once in people who have held a position for a long time. But changed. Enough. Send her in when she gets here, he said. And stay. If you don't mind. I think I'd like you to stay. At 7 o'clock exactly, Evelyn Carter knocked on the door of her father's study. She came in and saw Caleb in the chair to the right and her father behind the desk, and she stopped for just a fraction of a second, a pause so brief that only someone watching carefully would have caught it. And then she came and sat in the chair across from her father, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Edmund looked at his daughter. Victor is leaving tomorrow, he said. Evelyn's hands didn't move. Her expression didn't change. But something shifted in her breathing. A single, almost imperceptible deepening. All right, she said. I spoke with him this afternoon, and again this evening, Edmund said. We've agreed that the arrangement, the engagement, needs to be reconsidered. Now she looked at him. Really looked, with the full, undefended attention of someone hearing something they had stopped letting themselves want. Whose decision was that? She said carefully. Mine, Edmund said. Ultimately, mine. He paused. Victor was... He was not without his own reservations. I think you both may have been more clear-eyed about the situation than I was. He stopped, looked at his hands, looked back up. I am sorry, Evelyn, for a number of things, but right now, most immediately, for not asking about your work, for stopping asking. His voice had acquired a roughness. Your mother used to say that the thing she loved most about you was that you listened to things other people couldn't hear. I think I forgot that. The study held a silence that was nothing like the silences at the dinner table the night before. That silence had been managed. This one was real. Evelyn looked at her father for a long moment, and Caleb, watching her, saw the thing that happened in her face. Not the relief he might have expected, not the triumph, but something older and more complicated. Something that had grief and love and 12 years of careful distance, all wound together, and was now being very slowly, carefully unwound. Dad, she said. Just that. Just his name. Edmund Carter reached across the desk and put his hand over his daughter's. And whatever else he said too quietly for Caleb to hear, and Caleb decided that was as it should be, and he looked at the wall. Victor Langley's truck left Hawthorne Ridge Ranch the next morning at 7:15. Caleb was at the corral gate when it went. He didn't watch it go. He was watching Thunder Vale, who was watching it, ears tracking the sound until the engine faded, and then, slowly, by degrees, releasing the tension from his stance like an animal exhaling a breath it had been holding since Friday afternoon. He knows, Evelyn said beside him. Yeah, Caleb said. He knows. She was quiet for a moment. Then, my father wants to meet with us after the morning session. He said he wants to understand the rehabilitation program. She said it carefully, like someone testing whether a thing is real by saying it out loud. Your notebooks, Caleb said. All 11 of them, she said. Something moved across her face. A complicated, layered thing that had happiness and terror in equal measure, because that was what it felt like when something you built in the dark was suddenly going to be seen in the light. Hey, Caleb said. She looked at him. It's going to hold up, he said. The work you did. It's going to hold up in the light. She looked at him for a moment longer than was necessary, and he let her look, and didn't manage his expression, and she saw whatever she saw there, and turned back to the corral gate. Let's go to work, she said. What happened in the next 9 days was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. It was the specific beauty of something working the way it was supposed to work. Slow, cumulative, built on a foundation deep enough to hold. Thunder Vale allowed full contact on day 2 after Victor's departure. Caleb's hand flat on the horse's neck for 30 seconds. Then a minute. Then long enough that the counting stopped mattering. On day 5, Caleb put a halter on him. Not with force, not with any of the restraint techniques that the previous attempts had used, but with a patience so complete that the horse arrived at the halter rather than the halter arriving at the horse. On day 7, Caleb walked beside him with a lead rope, and the horse moved with the specific quality of an animal that is choosing to be led rather than being compelled. Roy Haddon watched all of this from the fence. He stopped making sounds of skepticism. He started arriving earlier in the morning. On day 6, he asked Caleb a question about the haltering technique, and Caleb answered it, and Roy listened with the straight-backed attention of a man revising a position he had held for a long time. On day 8, Roy said to Evelyn, "That thing you said about the injured leg. You were right. Vet confirmed it this morning. Minor tendon inflammation, but real. We're treating it." Evelyn looked at him. "I know," she said. Roy looked back at her. Something moved in his face that was not comfortable. "I should have listened sooner," he said. It cost him something to say it. She could see that it cost him, and she didn't make it cost more. "You're listening now," she said. "That's what matters." Roy nodded once and walked back to his work, and Evelyn stood at the fence, and something in her posture had changed. Not in a way that was dramatic or visible from a distance, but in the way that a person's posture changes when a weight has been taken off that they had been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it was there. The morning sessions with her father had begun to change the ranch in ways that moved quietly, but moved surely. Edmund Carter sat with 11 notebooks spread across his desk and read them with the focused, slightly humbled attention of a man looking at something he should have looked at years ago. He asked questions. Real questions, not the polite questions of someone performing interest, but the specific, operational questions of a businessman understanding a proposal. "What would the first phase cost?" he asked on the second morning session. "I have estimates," Evelyn said, and produced a document from the back of Notebook 9 that was detailed enough to make Caleb, sitting across the desk, realize that she had thought about this in terms of actual implementation for a very long time. Edmund reviewed the numbers. "The east pasture has been sitting fallow," he said. "I've been trying to decide what to do with it for 3 years." Evelyn looked at him. "That's the location I had in mind," she said. "In the plan. The east pasture." Edmund looked up from the document. Father and daughter looked at each other across a desk that had held a great many conversations, and this one, finally, was the right one. "Show me the rest of it," Edmund said. On day 10, Caleb put a saddle blanket on Thunder Vale's back. Just the blanket. No saddle, no weight, nothing that committed to the next step. Just the introduction of the thing. The letting the horse know it existed. The building of a fact that had time to become familiar before it had to become comfortable. Thunder Vale stood still for 7 minutes with the blanket on his back. He shuddered twice. He did not move his feet. Evelyn was beside Caleb the whole time, talking, because that was what she did. She talked the horse through it, the way a person talks a child through something frightening, not pretending the fear isn't real, but standing inside it with them until it becomes survivable. When they brought the blanket off, Caleb turned to her and said, "Tell me something." "What?" "That first day, when I pulled up and you were at the fence, you looked at me, just for a second before Roy brought me over. What were you thinking?" She looked at him. A small pause. "I was thinking that you moved like someone who was used to being alone," she said, "and that most people who move like that have a reason for it that they think is a choice." He absorbed that. "And now?" he said. She looked at the horse, then back at him. "Now I think you had a reason," she said. "And I'm not sure anymore that you think it's a choice." He held that sentence for a moment, turning it over. There was a quality to the honesty between them. Now that had been built so gradually, he hadn't noticed when it became the thing it was, something that had no performance in it, no management, just two people telling each other true things in the plain daylight. "I got an offer," he said. She went still. "What kind of offer?" "The American Quarter Horse Association. They want someone to run a training program. National scope. I'd be based in Texas but traveling most of the year. It's the kind of position. He stopped. It's the kind of position I've been working toward for a long time, without quite admitting that's what I was working toward. She looked at him with an expression that was very careful and very controlled. The expression of a woman who has learned to be precise about what she allows her face to show. "When did you find out?" she said. "The offer came 3 days ago," he said. "I've been trying to figure out what I want to say to them." And I don't know yet," he said. "That's the honest answer." She nodded slowly. She looked at the horse. Thunder Vale was watching them both with his enormous, dark, impossibly attentive eyes. And his ears were forward all the way, the full relaxed forward of an animal that has decided finally that the space it is in is safe. "You should take it," she said. Her voice was level. "Maybe," he said. "No, you should take it. That's important work, and you're the right person for it, and that matters. Work like that matters." "So does this," he said. She looked at him. This is almost done," she said. "Thunder Vale is almost where he needs to be. Your job here is almost finished." "I'm not talking about the horse," he said. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when a thing has been said, and the air around it is rearranging itself to accommodate the new fact. She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched her face go through several things in sequence. The guard coming up, the calculation running, the familiar practiced management beginning to assemble itself, and then stopping. Stopping because she had made a decision in the last 2 weeks about the muscle she had forgotten she had, and that decision applied here too. "Caleb," she said, "I have 11 notebooks and a plan, and my father is finally listening, and the horse is healing, and I am not the woman at the fence anymore. I am not standing outside of my own life watching it happen. I am not going to—" She stopped, took a breath. "I am not going to build something that depends on you staying. Because you are someone who has been moving for 20 years, and I don't know yet if you know how to stop. And I do not want to find out by being the reason you resent being here." It was the most honest thing she had said in the entire time he had known her. And it was honest in the way that the hardest true things are honest. Not cruel, not a rejection, but a limit drawn by someone who has finally learned that knowing where you end is not the same as closing yourself off. It is actually the opposite. Caleb stood with that truth and didn't try to argue it. "That's fair," he said. "I know it is," she said. For the first time in the conversation, her voice had something in it that wasn't steady, something small and real and unmanaged. "I just needed you to know that it's not because I don't—" She stopped again. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I know," he said again, quieter. She nodded, looked away, looked back. "Go work on your answer to them," she said, "and let me know what you decide." I went. And she stayed. And Thunder Vale stood in the late afternoon with his ears forward and his breathing slow. And when Evelyn put her hand on his neck, he leaned into it, just slightly, just enough. The way creatures lean into the things that have been steady for them when everything else was not. Inside the house, Edmund Carter was still at his desk with the notebooks open around him, making notes in his own handwriting in the margins of a business plan his daughter had written 4 years ago in the dark and was only now being read in the light. Roy Haddon was at the fence. He had started coming in the afternoons, standing where Evelyn had stood for 8 months, watching the horse with the particular attention of a man who has realized he has been looking at something the wrong way and is determined to look at it correctly now, even though it's late, even though he should have been looking correctly all along. Some learning comes early. Some learning comes at the cost of a great deal of time, and some embarrassment, and the specific humility of having been wrong in front of someone you underestimated. Roy Haddon was not a man given to public reckoning with himself. But he stood at that fence every afternoon, and he watched, and he learned, and that had to count for something. On day 12, Caleb sat on Thunder Vale's back for the first time. No drama, no audience by his choice. Just him and Evelyn in the corral in the early morning before anyone else was fully awake. He put the saddle on slowly, with the blanket that had been familiar for 2 days. With the girth tightened incrementally over 30 minutes, while Evelyn talked, and the horse breathed, and the world held still. And then Caleb put his foot in the stirrup. Thunder Vale trembled. Evelyn's voice, steady. The story of the girl and the horse in the valley, the one she had been telling for months, the one whose rhythm the horse knew by now, the way horses know things. Not in the mind, but in the body, in the place before thought, where memory lives. Caleb shifted his weight into the stirrup. The horse trembled harder. Held. Caleb swung up. He sat very still on the back of a horse that could have destroyed him, that had sent 2 men to the hospital, that 4 months ago would have killed anyone who tried this. And Thunder Vale stood. He trembled in every muscle, the effort of it enormous and visible, the battle between fear and trust playing out in the shaking of his flanks and the rigid set of his neck. And then, by degrees, slowly, the way glaciers move and seasons turn and the most important things happen, the trembling slowed, and Thunder Vale took a breath, and took a step. 1 step. Forward. Chosen. Evelyn stopped talking. Not because she had run out of things to say, because this was the moment after which words were not the right thing. She stood in the corral and watched the horse that everyone had given up on carry the man who had believed in him, 1 step at a time, across the packed earth of the corral in the early Montana morning. And her hand was over her mouth, and her eyes were bright, and she was not managing her expression at all. Caleb rode for 4 minutes. He came back to the center of the corral and dismounted as carefully as he had mounted, and he stood on the ground with his hand on the horse's neck, and Thunder Vale dropped his enormous head and pressed it against Caleb's chest. Caleb stood there for a moment with his eyes closed. He had broken a lot of horses. He had trained a lot of horses. He had never stood with a horse that was choosing to trust him and felt the full weight of what that choice cost the animal, what it meant to overcome everything. Your history had told you in order to believe in something new. He understood it differently now. He opened his eyes and looked at Evelyn. She was standing 12 feet away, with her hand still over her mouth, and her eyes doing the thing they had been doing since he met her, seeing everything, missing nothing. "Well," Caleb said. She lowered her hand. "Well," she said back. He looked at the horse. She looked at the horse. Thunder Vale looked at both of them with his ears forward and his breathing slow, and the morning was quiet around them in the way that mornings are quiet when something has finally been settled that needed to be settled for a very long time. "I'm not taking the job," Caleb said. She looked at him sharply. "Caleb, I've been moving for 20 years, he said. "I told you that. And you told me that you didn't know if I knew how to stop. I've been thinking about that for 3 days. He paused. "I know how to stop. I just never had a reason that was worth what stopping costs." She looked at him. The careful expression was back, but different now. Not defensive, just careful in the way that hope is careful, the way a person is careful with something they want very much not to break by wanting it wrong. "That's a big statement," she said. "I know. You've known me for 3 weeks. I know that too. That's not—" She stopped. "That's not very much time." "No," he said. "It's not. But it's enough time to know what I've been looking for without knowing I was looking." He looked at her steadily. "And it's enough time to know that those 11 notebooks deserve a real partner. Not someone who flies in and consults. Someone who stays." She looked at him for a long time. Long enough that the horse grew slightly bored with the tension between the 2 humans and dropped his head to sniff the ground. "You'd stay," she said, saying it to see how it sounded. "At Hawthorne Ridge. If your father would have me," he said. "In a professional capacity initially. I have some savings. I have a reputation that could bring horses here. What you're building could use someone with national connections." "You've been planning this," she said. "I've been thinking," he said. "There's a difference." "What is the difference?" "Planning assumes you know the outcome," he said. "Thinking is just being honest about what you want and seeing if the world has room for it." She looked at him. The bright eyes. The expression that was not managing itself anymore. "Does the world have room for it?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "But I'd like to find out. If you would." The morning held them both in its quiet. Thunder Vale lifted his head and looked at them each in turn, the horse that had been broken by everything that came through a gate before this, who had learned at last that not everything coming through a gate was a threat, that sometimes what came through a gate was the thing you had been needing. Evelyn looked at the man who had arrived to break a horse and had been, quietly and entirely, rebuilt himself. "Ask my father," she said. "See what he says." "And you?" She looked at him one more moment. Then she walked past him toward the gate, and her shoulder almost brushed his as she passed, and she said without turning around, "I'll be at the fence." It was not a no. Caleb stood in the corral with the horse and listened to her footsteps on the packed earth, and Thunder Vale pressed his head against Caleb's arm, warm and heavy and entirely present. And Caleb thought, "I came here to break something. Everything that got broken was inside me, and I did not break it. It was broken open, by a horse that needed to be seen, by a woman who had been watching from a fence and waiting, not for someone to rescue her, but for someone who was finally paying enough attention to understand what she already was." He stood a moment longer, then he walked toward the gate. Edmund Carter did not answer immediately when Caleb came to him. He listened. He sat behind his desk with his hands flat on the surface, and he listened to everything Caleb said. The professional proposal, the connections, the reputation, the specific ways that a man with 20 years and a national network could contribute to what Evelyn was building. And when Caleb finished speaking, Edmund was quiet for long enough that the silence had its own weight. Then he said, "Are you asking me about a job, or are you asking me about my daughter?" Caleb didn't flinch from it. "Both," he said. "In that order. Because the job is the part I can offer you proof of. The other part takes time, and I understand that. But I'm not going to pretend the other part isn't there, because you'd see through it, and so would she." Edmund looked at him. The old man's face had the particular quality of someone doing an honest calculation. Not hostile, not warm, just working through a problem with the full weight of his attention. "You've been here 3 weeks, Edmund said. "Yes, sir." "That's not very long." "No, sir, it's not." "Evelyn has had—" Edmund stopped, began again. "Her mother's death left her very self-contained. She learned to keep things inside, to manage her own expectations. I've watched men try to get close to her for 12 years, and she has always found a reason to stay behind the fence." He paused. "Metaphorically speaking." "I know," Caleb said. "You don't seem like the kind of man who stays in one place," Edmund said. "I haven't been," Caleb said. "That's the truth. But I think the reason I kept moving was that I kept arriving at places that didn't need what I actually had. They needed what I could perform. There's a difference, and I've spent 20 years learning it." He paused. "What Evelyn is building here needs what I actually have, and I think that matters." Edmund picked up a pen. He didn't write anything, he just held it. "The East Pasture Rehabilitation Program," he said. "Yes, sir." "I've been looking at her estimates. They're thorough." "They're more than thorough," Caleb said. "They're the work of someone who has been thinking operationally for 4 years. With the right support and the right partnerships, what she's designed could become a model. There are ranches across 5 states that deal with traumatized horses and have no systematic approach. What she's built in those notebooks is a systematic approach." Edmund set the pen down. He looked at it. "I owe her an apology that's larger than the one I've given her," he said quietly. "Not to you. I know that. But I want you to understand that I know that." "I do understand it," Caleb said. "She is." Edmund's voice acquired the roughness that had been there the previous evening, the roughness of a man whose emotions are real and not decorative. "She is the best thing I have done with my life, and I have spent the last several years acting like she was a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be supported, and I cannot—" He stopped, collected himself with the visible effort of someone unused to losing composure in front of people he doesn't know well. "I cannot undo that, but I can change what comes next." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "You can." Edmund looked at him. "Stay," he said. "On the terms you've described. Professional partnership first. I'll have my lawyer draw up an arrangement that makes sense for both parties." A pause. "The rest of it, the other part, That's between you and Evelyn. I'm not her keeper. I've tried to be, and it was wrong, and I'm done with it." He picked the pen up again. "But Caleb, if you hurt her, I am 73 years old, and I will still find a way to make that consequential for you." "Understood," Caleb said. Something in Edmund Carter's expression shifted, the seriousness breaking, just slightly, at the edges. "Good," he said. "Now get out of my study. I have 11 notebooks to finish reading." Caleb got out of his study. He found Evelyn at the fence. She was always at the fence, which had stopped being a limitation and had become a command post, the place from which she ran the operation she was building, and watched the animal she had healed, and thought the thoughts she no longer had to think in silence. He came and stood beside her, and she looked at him and read his face the way she read everything, completely, without missing anything, the first sweep telling her most of what she needed to know. "He said yes," she said. "Not a question." He said yes. She looked back at the corral. Thunder Vale was at the near end today, close to the fence, which was itself a thing worth noticing. A horse that had spent months at the far end, as far from human proximity as the enclosure allowed, voluntarily standing near the people who moved around him. "And you," she said. "You're sure?" "I've been sure since day 4, he said. "I just needed to be honest enough with myself to admit it." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Day 4, she repeated. "What happened on day 4? "You brought me coffee," he said, without asking if I wanted it. She turned to look at him. A pause. Then she laughed. A real laugh. The kind that comes from the chest without planning. The kind that she probably didn't allow herself often enough. "That's what decided it," she said. "Coffee." "It wasn't the coffee," he said. "It was what the coffee meant. You had already made a decision that I was worth a small act of care, without performance, without asking for anything back. You just decided, and you did it." He looked at her. "I haven't had many people in my life decide things like that." The laugh faded into something quieter and more real. She looked at him with the full, undefended attention she usually reserved for the horse. "I'm not easy," she said. "I want you to know that. I have 11 notebooks and opinions about everything, and I will tell you when I think you're wrong, and I will spend unreasonable amounts of time at this fence, and I am building something that is going to take years, and I don't—" She paused. "I don't know how to be small anymore. I tried for a long time, and I'm not doing it again." "Good," he said. "Don't." She looked at him. "Evelyn," he said, "I have been doing a job for 20 years that is fundamentally about learning to see what something actually is, rather than what you expect it to be. And what I see when I look at you is someone who has been waiting, not for rescue, not for permission, just for someone to finally be paying enough attention." He held her gaze. "I'm paying attention. I plan to keep paying attention. That's the whole of what I'm offering." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, not with the weight of ceremony. Just a decision, made and acted on. The way she made every decision. Directly, without hedging, with the full commitment of someone who has learned that halfway in is more dangerous than either staying out or going all the way through. Her hand was warm and slightly rough from the fence rails, and completely certain. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said back. Thunder Vale, 12 feet away, lifted his head and looked at them both with his ears all the way forward. What followed was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of the thing that had been quietly constructing itself since the first morning, the shape of a life that neither of them had quite been able to see clearly enough to name, built from notebooks and fence rails, and 20 years of moving, and 8 months of watching, and the specific courage it takes to stand still inside a frightened animal's space and keep your voice steady until the fear becomes bearable. The East Pasture Rehabilitation Program broke ground 6 weeks after Caleb's first ride on Thunder Vale. Edmund Carter signed the documents that allocated the land, and he stood at the edge of the East Pasture on a cold Montana morning and watched his daughter walk the boundary of the space that had been her plan for 4 years. And the expression on his face was the expression of a man who is watching something he should have built sooner and is choosing not to make that regret the loudest thing in the room. Roy Haddon ran the construction crew. He did it with the methodical competence he brought to everything, and with a new quality that Caleb had begun to notice in him over the preceding weeks. A listening quality, a willingness to stop before deciding, to ask before assuming. It wasn't transformation. Roy Haddon was not a man who transformed, but he was a man who learned when the evidence was sufficient, and the evidence at Hawthorne Ridge had been sufficient for some time. On the first day of construction, Roy came to Evelyn with a set of plans and spread them on the fence rail and said, "I made some modifications to the layout you described. I want you to look at them before we build." Evelyn looked at the plans. She looked at the modifications. She asked 2 questions, made 1 correction, and approved the rest. "Those are good changes," she said. Roy rolled the plans back up. "You would have gotten there," he said. He stopped. Tried again. "I've been thinking about that thing you said, about the gates, about how he watched the gates because the bad things came through them." He paused. "So I moved the access points, put them on the north side, away from where the main activity is, so the animals coming in here don't have to arrive through the busy side." Evelyn looked at him. "Roy," she said. "Don't make a thing of it," he said, and walked back to his crew. She stood at the fence, because she was always at a fence, which was no longer a limitation, but simply the place where her thinking happened best. And she watched him go, and she felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. The thing that settles when the world around you begins, slowly and imperfectly, to catch up to what you knew. The first horse to arrive at the East Pasture Rehabilitation Program was not Thunder Vale. He was already home. The first horse was a 5-year-old gray mare named Cassidy, transported from a failed operation in Idaho, with scar tissue along her flank and a trust deficit so severe that 3 veterinarians had recommended euthanasia. Evelyn received her on a Tuesday morning. Caleb watched from a distance, deliberately, giving her the space that was hers to own. As Evelyn approached the trailer, as she stood at the distance she had learned was right, as she began to talk. Not to the mare specifically. To the air around the mare, to the space. The way she had learned to do, the way that was not technique, but something older and less teachable. The gray mare stood trembling in the trailer door. Evelyn talked. Caleb couldn't hear the words, the distance was too great, but he could see the rhythm, the steadiness, the quality of her stillness. He could see, in the set of her shoulders, that she was fully present in a way that most people were not capable of sustaining. Not performing presence, being it. The mare took 1 step out of the trailer. Caleb exhaled. He had a phone in his pocket with an unanswered message from the American Quarter Horse Association. They had come back to him a second time, adjusted the offer, made it genuinely difficult to refuse. He had read it twice that morning and put the phone away both times. He looked at Evelyn with the trembling gray mare making her careful, terrified way into the East Pasture. And he thought about 20 years of moving, and what it had cost him, and what he had gotten for that cost. And he thought about the specific warmth of a mug of coffee handed to him without performance on a cold Montana morning. He took the phone out. He wrote a reply to the American Quarter Horse Association. He thanked them sincerely. He told them honestly that his situation had changed, and he wished them well in finding someone who would do the position justice. He sent it before he could think about it further. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked toward the East Pasture. Evelyn had moved the mare to the near fence without a lead rope. The mare was following her the way Thunder Vale had followed her 8 months earlier, because there was something in the way she moved, in the specific quality of her attention, that horses recognized before they understood it. She turned when she heard Caleb's boots on the ground, and she read his face the way she always read his face. "You answered them," she said. "I did." "What did you say?" "No," he said. She looked at him for a moment. The careful expression, the hope that was being precise with itself. "Caleb, don't," he said gently. "I've thought about it long enough. I made a decision, and it's made." He looked at the mare, who was watching them both with cautious, intelligent eyes. "Tell me about her." Evelyn looked at the mare. "Her name is Cassidy, 5 years old." The scarring on her left flank is from a restraint method that should be illegal and isn't. Her heart rate elevates before she shows external signs of stress, which means by the time she looks afraid, she's already been afraid for a while. You have to learn to read the earlier signals. Which are? Her ears do this thing, Evelyn said, and demonstrated with her hands. A subtle rotation, not the full pinning of acute fear, but an asymmetric tracking. One goes back before the other. When that happens, you have about 40 seconds before the visible stress response. Caleb watched the mare. As if on cue, as if the horse had heard herself described, one ear rotated back. Just slightly. Just one. There, Evelyn said quietly. I see it, Caleb said. They stood and did nothing, which was the right thing, and in 30 seconds the ear came back forward and the mare's shoulder released a degree of tension. Good girl, Evelyn said softly. To the horse, to the morning, to something larger than either. They stood together at the fence of the East Pasture Rehabilitation Program on a cold Montana morning, and the mare that 3 veterinarians had given up on grazed 12 feet from the woman who had not. And behind them, the ranch moved and breathed and was becoming something different than it had been. The formal opening of the program happened on a Saturday, 2 months after construction completed. Evelyn had not wanted a ceremony. Edmund had insisted, gently, with the specific persistence of a father trying to give back something he had withheld too long, and she had agreed to a small gathering, which was not small. The ranch hands came. The veterinarian came. A woman named Dr. Patricia Holloway, who ran equine welfare research at Montana State University, drove 3 hours because Evelyn had sent her a letter 6 weeks prior with a summary of the program's methodology, and Dr. Holloway had called back within 48 hours with a level of professional enthusiasm that had made Evelyn sit down heavily in the kitchen and press both hands to her face. Caleb had watched her on that phone call. He had watched her stand up straighter as Dr. Holloway spoke. He had watched the particular transformation that happens when someone who has been building something in the dark finds out that the thing they built is real. Not just real to them, but real in the way that the world can confirm and build on and use. Dr. Holloway shook Evelyn's hand at the opening with both of hers and said, "The methodology you've developed for assessing trauma response in domestic horses is genuinely novel. I want to talk to you about a research partnership." Evelyn looked at the woman who was saying these words. "I have notebooks," she said. Dr. Holloway smiled. "I would very much like to see them." Roy Haddon, standing 6 feet away, turned to look at the construction of the East Pasture fence with the focused attention of a man who is pretending to examine craftsmanship in order to manage his expression. Edmund Carter stood with a glass of something warm and watched his daughter talk to a university researcher with 11 notebooks under her arm, and his face was the face of a man who has made mistakes and cannot undo them and has chosen to stand in the present rather than the past, which is the only thing that can be done with mistakes of that kind and the right thing besides. And Caleb stood at the edge of the gathering and watched all of it. The program, the people, the horses in the East Pasture being handled with patience and precision by the methods Evelyn had spent 4 years developing in the dark. And he felt something in his chest that took him a moment to identify, because he was not accustomed to feeling it. He felt at home, not in the way that a house is home. He had houses. He'd had them all over the country, and none of them had been this. This was the other kind. The kind that is not a location, but a quality of being. The feeling of being exactly where you are supposed to be, doing exactly the work that is yours, beside exactly the person you were working your way toward without knowing it. He had been moving for 20 years. He had stopped. It did not feel like stopping. It felt like arrival. There was a moment, late in the afternoon of the opening day, when the gathering had thinned, and the horses were quiet, and the last of the visitors were making their way to their cars, when Evelyn came and stood beside Caleb, and they looked at the East Pasture together. Inside the pasture, Cassidy, the gray mare who had arrived trembling and scarred, was moving with a loose, easy quality that she had not had 4 weeks ago. Not running, not frantic, just moving. The way an animal moves when its nervous system has finally received, and tentatively believed, the message that it is safe. And Thunder Vale was in the adjacent corral, because Thunder Vale was always somewhere close to Evelyn, which was simply a fact of the world now, like weather and gravity. He was watching the gray mare with his ears forward and his head low, and the ease of an animal that has crossed over from fear into something on the other side of fear, where the air is different and the ground feels solid. "He's showing her," Evelyn said quietly. Caleb looked at the black stallion. He was at the shared fence between the two enclosures, and his body language was open and curious and entirely without threat. The specific language of a horse that is being safe at another horse, modeling it, the way animals that have learned safety sometimes offer it to the ones that haven't. "You think he knows?" Caleb said. "I think he remembers," she said. "I think he remembers what it felt like before. And I think he knows this place is different. And I think animals are better than people at sharing what they know without making a production of it." Caleb looked at her. She was looking at the horses, and the late afternoon light was on her face, and she was not managing her expression and had not been for some time. And what was on her face was complete. The full version of her, without reduction, without the careful subtraction she had practiced for years. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need to tell you now, because I've been carrying it for a while. And the reason I've been carrying it, instead of saying it is the same reason you kept your notebooks to yourself for 4 years, which is that some things feel too important to risk by saying out loud before you're sure they'll hold." She went still. That particular stillness. "I am sure they'll hold," he said. "So here it is." He paused. "I love you. Not because you're part of something I've built here. Not because the work brought me close enough to see you clearly, but because you are the clearest thing I have ever seen. You are the person who hears what's underneath, who shows up every day, who builds things in the dark because the building is necessary, not because someone is watching." He held her gaze. "I have been in the company of a lot of remarkable things in 20 years. You are the most remarkable, and I don't want to spend any more time moving away from you." She looked at him. The east pasture was quiet. The gray mare moved. Thunder Vale stood at the fence. "That's a lot of words," she said. Her voice was slightly unsteady, which was the most unsteady he had ever heard it. "I've been saving them up," he said. She looked at him for one more moment, and then she stepped forward and put her arms around him with the same quality she brought to everything, completely, without hedging, with the full commitment of someone who has decided that halfway in is not a way she lives anymore. He held on. They stood like that for a moment in the quiet of the east pasture, on the afternoon of the thing she had built, and the horse that had been waiting for someone to understand him watched them from the fence with his ears forward and his breathing slow. The months that followed were not without difficulty. The work was hard, physically hard, emotionally hard, the specific difficulty of asking frightened animals to trust again when trust had cost them so much. There were horses that came to the program in states that broke Evelyn's heart, and she let them break it every time, because she had decided a long time ago that the alternative, the careful protective distance of not letting it matter, was not something she was willing to do. Every horse mattered. She would not practice not caring. Caleb was there for all of it. Not as a manager, not as a consultant, not as someone who had arrived to fix things and would eventually leave when they were fixed. As a partner, in the operational sense, with equity in the program and a legitimate stake in its future, and in the other sense, the one that didn't have a business term, the one that was simply what it was. He called in favors from 20 years of connections. He brought horses to Hawthorne Ridge from operations that didn't know where else to send them. He spoke about the program at a conference in Denver in November, and the response was significant enough that Evelyn had to hire 2 additional staff by January. She hired them herself. She interviewed them. She evaluated them. She made the decisions. Caleb sat in on the interviews at her request and kept his opinions until she asked for them. She always asked for them. She just needed to be the one to decide. I understood that. He would have understood it even if she hadn't explained it, but she explained it anyway, because she was someone who explained things clearly and expected clarity back, which was one of the qualities about her that he found easiest to love. Roy Haddon became, by quiet and practical degrees, something close to a convert. Not to sentimentality. Roy Haddon would never be sentimental about horses or much else, but to the methodology. He attended 2 of Evelyn's assessment sessions and asked questions afterward with the specific precision of someone integrating new information into an existing structure. He started using the language, processing, recalibrating, trust gap. Without self-consciousness, the way people start using words when the words have proven themselves accurate. One afternoon in February, Roy came to Evelyn with a horse he had assessed himself. "I think she's ready for a lead rope," he said, and he laid out his observations with a thoroughness that would have been unrecognizable 3 months earlier. The timing, the body language, the specific signals he had looked for and found. Evelyn reviewed his assessment. "You missed one thing," she said. "What?" "Her breathing pattern in the last 5 minutes. It shortened. She was moving toward anxiety before you called it." Roy looked at the horse. "She didn't show it externally." "No, she contained it. Some horses learn to contain the external response because the external response was punished. The internal one keeps happening. You have to learn to look for the containment, not just the visible sign." Roy was quiet for a moment. "How do you learn to look for the containment?" "You spend a lot of time being very still and watching very carefully," she said. "And you stop deciding what you're going to see before you see it." He looked at her. Then he looked at the horse. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He stayed for another hour. He watched. He was very still. Thunder Vale, in the adjacent corral, had by now become so thoroughly himself that it was almost difficult to remember the horse that had been there before. The animal made entirely of fear, slamming into fence rails, screaming at a volume that shook the posts. The horse that was here now had the specific quality of an animal that has survived something and knows it, and carries that knowledge not as damage, but as depth. How was ridden regularly by the time spring came. Not by anyone, not by a stranger, but by people who had earned it the way Caleb had earned it. Slowly, without shortcuts, with the full respect of someone who understood what had been overcome. The best rides were the ones Evelyn took him on. She had started riding in March, with Caleb beside her on a steady quarter horse named Daisy, who served as something like moral support for both of them. Evelyn on Thunder Vale's back was something that Caleb watched with the specific internal quality of a man who is seeing something beautiful and is aware, in real time, that he is seeing it. She rode with her hands light and her body relaxed, and the complete quiet of someone who has been communicating with this animal in every language available for nearly a year, and finds the addition of movement to that communication. Simply one more thing to listen to. Thunder Vale under her was not the horse that had injured 2 men and been labeled impossible. He was something else. Something on the other side of his history, which he carried but was no longer defined by. He moved with the particular quality of an animal that has been given back its own dignity. And the woman on his back was the reason for it, and he knew it the way horses know things, in the body, before thought. Caleb rode beside her on a Tuesday morning in April. The sky the specific blue of Montana in spring. The air still cold enough to see breath. And he watched her on the black horse, and he thought about the first day he had arrived at this ranch, and the woman he had seen at the fence, and the thought that had gone through his head in that first moment. Who on earth is she? He knew the answer now. He had been learning it for 7 months, in the way that you learn the things that matter. Not all at once, not with a single revelation, but by accumulation, by showing up, by paying attention past the point where most people stop paying attention. She was the person who heard what was underneath, who built things in the dark, who showed up every day at the fence and talked to a frightened horse until the horse remembered how to be safe, and who had been doing this. All of this, the listening, the building, the patient daily presence, long before anyone was watching. She had not needed to be rescued. She had needed to be seen. And the man who had arrived at Hawthorne Ridge Ranch, 41 years old, and certain he had already seen everything this world had to offer, had discovered, in the course of 1 season, that he had been seeing a narrow version of everything. The part that moved, the part that had a clear beginning and a clear end, the part that could be broken or fixed and then left behind. He had not known how to see the other kind, the kind that grew, the kind that required you to stay still long enough for it to show you what it was. He was learning. Every day he was learning. On a morning in May, 6 horses moved through the East Pasture Rehabilitation Program. 3 had arrived as what the people who sent them had called hopeless cases. None of them were hopeless. They were frightened, which is not the same thing, and they were healing, which takes longer than breaking, but holds longer too. Evelyn walked the pasture in the morning the way she always walked it, stopping at each fence line, assessing, making notes in a notebook that was not one of the original 11, but was part of the ongoing series, the series that did not have an end point. Caleb walked with her, which was where he was in the mornings now, where he intended to be. Dr. Patricia Holloway was coming in 2 weeks with a graduate student and a proposal for a formal research study. The program had been contacted by operations in 3 states. Edmund Carter had stopped carrying the weight of 12 years of the wrong decision in the set of his shoulders. Roy Haddon had asked Evelyn to start a weekly session for the ranch staff on equine behavior assessment, which was Roy Haddon's way of acknowledging that he should have been learning this a long time ago and intended to learn it now. At the near fence of the East Pasture, the gray mare Cassidy stood in the morning with her ears forward and her breathing slow, and the relaxed quality of an animal that has received, enough times that it has begun to believe it, the message that this is a safe place, that the people here show up, that the gates open for good things as often as they open for frightening ones. She was not fully healed. Healing didn't work that way. Not for horses, not for people. The history stayed. It just stopped being the whole story. Evelyn stopped at the fence beside Cassidy, and the mare moved toward her, which was still something, every single time, that stopped the breath. The willingness. The tentative, rebuilt willingness of a creature to move toward rather than away. It was the whole of it, in one gesture. The whole point. She reached through the fence and put her hand flat on the mare's neck, and the mare stood. Caleb put his hand over Evelyn's. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the mare, watching her, reading her the way she always read, completely, without missing anything. But her hand turned under his and held on, and that was its own kind of complete attention. They stood at the fence in the May morning, with the horse between them, and the ranch moving behind them, and the life that had been building itself quietly for 7 months solid around them, like something that had always been meant to be there, waiting for the right people to arrive and be still long enough to let it take shape. Caleb Whitmore had come to Hawthorne Ridge Ranch to break a horse. He had arrived certain and skilled and moving, the way he had arrived everywhere, ready to do the job and leave before the leaving cost anything, and he had found a woman at a fence who listened to things other people couldn't hear, who had spent 8 months building trust with a frightened animal that everyone else had given up on, who had 11 notebooks full of 4 years of work done in the dark without an audience, who had been told her whole life what she should be and had never stopped knowing what she was. He had not broken anything at Hawthorne Ridge. Everything that had been broken here, by the time it was done, had been healed. The horse, the ranch, the distance between a father and his daughter, the practiced isolation of a man who had confused movement with purpose for 20 years. And the woman who had been standing at the fence, who had never been waiting for someone to rescue her, had gotten exactly what she had always deserved. Someone who finally, fully, paid enough attention to see her. She had been the one who understood, before anyone else did, that the horse was not the problem. Fear was the problem. And fear, when met with patience and consistency, and the specific courage of someone who shows up every day without demanding anything in return, becomes something survivable, becomes something healed, becomes, with enough time and enough showing up, something that looks almost like trust. That was what she had built here. Not just a program, not just a plan from 11 notebooks finally given room to breathe, but a place where broken things were given what they needed most. Someone who would not look away, someone who would stay, someone whose presence said every single day, without words, "You are safe. I am here. You are safe." The horse had known it first. The man had learned it after. And the woman at the fence had known it all along.